Shalom and welcome to today's episode of True and False on the Arab-Israeli conflict. My name is James McKeever, I'm an Israeli tour guide and educator, and today's video has the truth that the UN is heavily biased against Israel. Maybe so much so that Israel should not be held accountable by the UN. So what is the UN? Well, it's an international body formed after World War II with the purpose of maintaining peace between nations, upholding human rights, enforcing international law, and providing aid to refugees and people in need around the planet. It has failed pretty miserably at those tasks. However, this video is specifically about its relation with the only Jewish state, the State of Israel. They are currently trying Israel on a charge of genocide brought forward by South Africa. If you're interested in learning about the non-genocide, which is not happening here, see my video about the genocide that's not happening in Gaza. But regardless of the genocide or non-genocide, should Israel be listening to the UN, particularly whilst it is in the middle of a war with one of the most brutal terror regimes on the planet, which currently holds around 136 Israeli civilians hostage? The UN member states, as a general rule, are a lineup of some of the world's worst scum and villainy, with 70% of the countries being non-democratic and many terrible human rights violators, not just of their own people, but of their neighbours, with non-free press. We're going to get to that later. But even if we accept this organisation as the best of a bunch of bad alternatives, with the bias it shows towards Israel, which I will show is the case, should Israel be listening to them? The General Assembly, which is a group of all of the nations who are member states, from 2015 to 2022, out of 208 resolutions, 140 of them were against the State of Israel. Nearly 2/3 were against one specific, over 2/3 were against one specific country. A democratic state with human rights, equal law for its citizens, was targeted. Out of all, think of the worst human rights violators, some of the worst countries in the world. We weren't just considered worse than them, we were considered worse than all of them and the others combined. The UN has an obsession with Israel. But I'm talking about whether or not Israel should listen to the UN. Why should we be an exception? We are members of these treaties. So why should Israel be an exception? Well, very simply, because we are treated as an exception, as this statistic clearly shows. Don't worry, guys, I've got more statistics coming. Even in 2022, with the Russia-Ukraine war in full flow, as Russia invaded another sovereign nation, the UN brought more resolutions, not just against Russia, but then against the rest of the world combined. Israel had 15 resolutions against it, whilst Russia had 6, and another 7 for the rest of the world outside of those two countries. Okay, so that's the General Assembly. That's all of them together. But what about the World Health Organization and the UNESCO Heritage Organization? These are two organizations with no connection to conflict. However, they only have resolutions against one specific country. And you guessed it, that country is the only Jewish state on planet Earth, Israel. Now let's get into the Human Rights Council, because that's what this is really all about. Human rights. Israel is currently being charged with genocide. Well, the Human Rights Council was actually reformed in 2006 because its predecessor was so biased, ineffectual, and just generally useless that they had to start it again from scratch. But since then, have things improved? Not much. 68 of the 136 resolutions until 2022 were against Israel. Again, this doesn't just make us, statistically speaking, the worst human rights violators in the world. This makes us worse than the rest of the world combined. Think about totalitarian regimes like North Korea, China with no free press, Cuba, which is non-democratic, Turkey, who after slaughtering the Armenians is now doing a good job at slaughtering the Kurds, Saudi Arabia with no freedom of religion, Syria that murdered 300,000 of their own civilians in the civil war. That's more people than Israel has killed in all of its wars combined. They even use chemical weapons, as well as the Iraqis using chemical weapons against their own civilians, own citizens. And yet Israel is considered not just the worst in the world, but worse than the rest of them combined. Israel, a democratic state with freedom of press, freedom of protest, all citizens being equal under the law, equality between men and women, with minority groups serving in the parliament, serving in the judiciary, an independent judiciary also. They also serve with minorities serving in the military, law enforcement, everything. And we are worse than these countries, according to the UN. It's ridiculous. And now South Africa has added to the pool of shame, a government renowned for its corruption and neglect of its people. But it has really outdone itself now by siding with terrorists. Again, not just any terrorists, we're talking about ISIS styles, one of the worst terror organizations on planet Earth. And the South Africans have gone and allied with them in an attempt to attack Israel, demanding a ceasefire against this terror organization whilst they hold Israeli civilians captive. I wonder how many of the people in that UN courtroom would be willing for themselves, let alone their families, their children, to live next to a terror organization like Hamas, to suffer massacres like what happened on the 7th of October. They talk about, in the accusation against Israel, about the trauma being caused to Gazan civilians, which I'm sure is the case. However, we haven't heard a peep, not even a whisper, for the 18 years of Israeli children being raised under rocket fire, raised with post-traumatic stress, their bedrooms being bomb shelters, waiting for the next missile, death, to fall on them from the sky. After the 7th of October, many Israelis actually expected the world to start to understand our position, understand the kind of people and organizations that we are fighting against. In some cases, there was no sympathy or understanding whatsoever. Public opinion began to change within weeks, and it took only 3 months for us to be hauled up in front of an international court run by an organization with demonstrable bias against us. Again, how many of those people would suffer living next to Hamas? Or maybe more poignantly, how many of those countries would just have bombed Gaza into non-existence without sending in any ground troops, without making any measures to try to save civilian life? Incidentally, the Israeli army does more than any other army in the world to prevent the loss of civilian life. And yet these are the slings and arrows that they throw at us. It's disgraceful. The governments of the world and useful idiots for Palestine wring their hands over the Gazan civilians, whilst barely mentioning, if at all, mentioning or condemning the actions of Hamas, whose massacre on the 7th of October caused the Israeli response, and whose use of human shields and firing from safe zones created by the Israeli military is the main cause of the civilian casualties. And yet they condemn Israel and don't condemn Hamas. Even if you want to condemn Israel, you can't bring yourselves to condemn a terror organization who explicitly states in its charter its desire to commit genocide. What is wrong with them? And now we get to the cherry on the cake. UNRWA. UNRWA is the UN relief and works agency that give aid to Palestinian refugees. If you want to see historic Palestine video, talks about whether or not Palestinian refugees actually exist in the sense that the UN calls them, but that's by the by. They provide aid and education to Palestinian children. And we have videos of UNRWA employees, teachers, teaching children to hate Jews, to hate Israel, and encourage them to commit acts of violence against the state of Israel. Bear in mind, they work for an organization whose intended purpose is to create peace among nations. And they are teaching violence and hate. Okay, James, well, maybe it's just a few bad apples. No. The information is actually up there on their social media pages. It's not hidden at all. It is there for anyone to see. There are videos of these teachers teaching hate and violence, and their colleagues are liking and commenting and supporting these messages. But it gets even worse. It's not just a few bad apples teaching some bad things. Israel has produced proof of 12 UNRWA employees who were actively involved in the 7th of October massacre. UN employees who committed murder and rape of Israeli civilians. Can you imagine being hauled up in front of a court where the court's own employees committed murder and rape against the defendant's family, and the defendant is on trial for his response? Insanity doesn't even cover it. It's disgusting. When the UN's own employees are actively involved in massacres, they've lost all moral right position to judge anyone, most definitely not Israel, who they have been attacking for decades. One last little point in this happy little video is just to point out that one of the reasons that so many Jews are here in Israel is because we had to leave the lands of these member states, whether it be Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, or the Arab-speaking world. Jews were persecuted, massacred, and expelled. And you know what? We decided we'll come home to the place where our ancestors lived, where we belong. And yet these countries are now trying to persecute and accuse us here in our own home after chasing us out of those countries. So the UN's hypocrisy, its bias, and its blatant, statistically provable persecution of the only Jewish state shows it is not only not fit for purpose as an organization as a whole, but most definitely not fit for purpose to try Israel. And its accusations and trying us for genocide and not throwing this case out are shameful. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe to my video. Peace, but not today.